Good afternoon. Welcome to the Museum from Home. My name is Penny. I work here at the National Museum in the Lifelong Learning team. As always, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. We're filming today on the lands of the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples of Canberra. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'm here today with Michaela Harkins from our Indigenous Knowledges Centre, who shortly will be taking us on a guided tour of the new Torres Strait Islander space. Michaela, do you mind introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about the Indigenous Knowledges Centre and what they do here at the museum?
Hi everyone at home, my name's Michaela and I'm a curator with the Indigenous Knowledges Centre. We're just one of the small teams that is part of the bigger curatorial team at the National Museum, and we look after any First Australians content, so that's any Aboriginal and any Torres Strait Islander content. And we really like to work with people to bring their stories to life.
We're going to shortly head out into the gallery for a tour that Michaela recorded for us a couple of days ago. Don't forget that we are live streaming and we are here to answer your questions, so if you have any questions, please pop them into the YouTube stream and we will get to them after the tour. Thank you.
This is the Torres Strait Islander space at the National Museum of Australia. The Torres Strait Islands are a group of over 200 islands that are spread out across 48,000 square kilometres of ocean. They lie between the tip of Queensland and Papua New Guinea and are actually part of Australia. They were formed originally when ocean levels rose across a land bridge that originally joined Australia to Papua New Guinea. There are 5 different regions in the Torres Strait Islands: the inner, near western, top western, central and eastern regions. The flag of the Torres Strait Islands was designed by a man named Bernard Namok Sr. The design features a white dari, which is a ceremonial headdress and is an iconic symbol of the Torres Strait Islands. It also features a 5-pointed star, which represents the 5 different regions in the Torres Strait. We're actually going to go have a walk through the galleries now and have a look at some of the objects that we have here in this space. Pearling was a very important industry in the Torres Strait Islands from the 1860s until after World War II. Torres Strait Islanders were very involved in the industry, and they worked closely with people from many nations across the world, especially the Japanese. This wall hanging behind me was created by Torres Strait artist Rosie Ware. It was commissioned by the Fuji family and the Australian-Japan Foundation to commemorate the Japanese involvement in what was a very important industry for the Torres Strait Islands. The wall hanging is done in classic Japanese style, but features some incredible motifs that are from the Torres Strait Islands. At the top, you can see a ceremonial headdress called a dari that is usually worn while dancing. You can also see a diving helmet. Now, most of the divers in the pearling industry were actually Japanese, and so they had a very, very dangerous job. These helmets were completely metal and they were very heavy, and the divers wore rubberized suits and very heavy shoes to dive all the way to the bottom of the ocean. In the middle of the wall hanging, you can see a pearl shell. And while the pearling industry was about the pearls themselves, pearl shell was also an incredibly important part of the trade. Pearl shell was actually used widely in society. They made buttons, combs, the backs of mirrors, the handles of cutlery and all kinds of decorative elements for furniture, etc. with pearl shell. It was actually one of the most important components of the whole industry. Pearl shell was also incredibly important to the Torres Strait Islanders, who used it in many traditional decorations, including on their headdresses. You can also see on the wall hanging down the bottom there a pearl lugger. Luggers were boats that were used in the pearling industry, and they had very specific components to them that made them specially suited for this task. This model of a pearling lugger was built by artist George Mosby. He's from Wyburn or Thursday Island. During pearling, pretty much all of the boats that were built on Thursday Island were built by the Japanese. There are some really interesting things about a pearling lugger. You can see on the deck here that there are models of the diving helmets worn by Japanese divers. You can also see that the sides of the boat are very low, and this is to make it easier for the divers to get on and off the boat in their really heavy suits. This canoe was made specifically for the National Museum of Australia by the Saibai community. They put the canoe together when it arrived here, as it's too big to fit through any of our doors. The canoe is made from a red cedar log that was sourced from Papua New Guinea. There aren't actually any trees big enough to make canoes in the Torres Strait, and considering Saibai is only 4 kilometres away from the Papua New Guinean mainland, it was much easier for them to source a tree from New Guinea for us. The sails are made out of woven palm leaves, and they're held up by bamboo masts. The whole thing actually weighs about 650 kilograms, so it's very heavy. You can see that it's a double outrigger, which means that it actually has stabilizers on both sides of the boat, which is great because it means that it is more stable as it goes through larger waves. We recently had to move the canoe, which is named Kolba Saibai, from its old home to this new spot in the museum. We find it really important that we work with community when we're doing these kinds of things, because it means that we can learn from each other. We invited a man named Mr. Avon Noah Jr. to come from the Torres Strait to help us move the canoe earlier. We got him to show us how to take it apart piece by piece so that it actually fit through the doors, and then we got him to teach our conservations team how to put it back together and tie all of the correct knots. We're now entering another section of our Torres Strait Islander galleries where we keep some of our ghost net collection. Ghost nets are actually sculptures that are created using nets that have fallen off fishing boats. It's a really big problem, especially in the TSI, and it creates a lot of environmental damage. What the artists from Arab Arts have been doing is using these nets to create beautiful sculptural pieces. So we actually have 3 sculptures above me. The first one is called Kebi Korang, and it's by an artist named Racy Wee Pitt. This one is actually a little blue pufferfish, and I love how the tail is just made out of shredded nets. We also have a dugong that is called Dungal, and it's made by Florence Mabel Gutchin. And you can see the different colours of nets that have been woven together to create the skin of the dugong. We also have our last one, which is a little red fish called Mama La, which is a popular fish in the Torres Strait, and it's made by an artist named Marianne Bourne. The Arab Island artists are actually at the pioneering forefront of making these beautiful sculptures, and we have quite a few in the museum's collection. We have just got a few on display here, but we also have a life-size dinghy, which has an outboard motor, oars, and a petrol can. This sculpture was made by artist Nancy Kiewat, and it commemorates the coming of the light celebrations. You can see that it's in the shape of a cross, and it's also actually made out of ghost nets. The artist has used a number of different techniques to put this together. You can see that around some parts she's wrapped ghost net. There's also some parts where net has been matted together to form a stuffing. And there's also a lot of weaving to hold pieces together and to add all of these decorative elements. You can also see down the bottom of the sculpture that the artist has featured a Bible verse. This verse actually talks about God as light, and so ties directly into the coming of the Light Festival. This sculpture actually won the Gabtatui Art Centre Art Prize in 2017, and we're really lucky that it's part of the National Museum's collections.
The new Torres Strait Islander spaces down in Gallery First Australians are really quite stunning. Before we get onto the live stream questions, Michaela, can I ask you if you have any particular favourites of the objects that you just spoke about?
I think I'm a little bit biased because I selected them all to go on display. So I picked out my favourites in the collection. I do have a bit of a soft spot though for the little pufferfish that you saw in the video. I just think that they're so expressive and the colour that's being used in it is so amazing. And like I said in the video, the tail just gets me, the little shredded nets. I think there's just something so endearing about them, and it really puts a really beautiful, colourful spin on ghost net sculpture.
They have beautiful little faces too, those ghost net sculptures.
They really do.
We're starting to get some questions in off our live stream. Catherine would like to know if the canoe has ever actually been in the water.
I know it might be surprising because it's a museum object, but yes, the canoe has actually been in the water. It was made specifically for us by the Saibai community up in the TSI, and as part of the process of bringing it to the museum, they did actually float the canoe. I think it was on the Brisbane River. But canoes are made for water, and it's sort of all about that living objects, and the objects do have purposes and lives. So.
A ship in the harbour is safe, but that's not what a ship is for.
Exactly.
What did people use the outrigger canoes for? That's from Alana.
Yeah. Well, basically, the Torres Strait is a collection of islands. Only 18 of the islands are inhabited at the moment, but there are hundreds of them, and they all have different resources on the islands, and people need to be able to get at those resources. So the canoes were mostly used for travel, hunting, fishing, those kinds of things. So they were really, really important parts of life in the Torres Strait and being able to move and collect what you needed to live.
Speaking of important parts of the Torres Strait, Shark, we would like to know what's important about dugongs in the Torres Strait Islands.
Gosh, I find dugongs so amazing. They're actually called sea cows because, well, obviously they look a little bit like cows, but funny fact that I found out very recently is they're actually really closely related to elephants more than whales or dolphins, which I think is quite funny considering they live in the water. But dugongs are actually really important as a food source in the TSI, and Torres Strait Islanders have been hunting them for generations. So people can still hunt dugongs. You have to have a license, and you have to be a Torres Strait Islander to get a license. And you also have to use a traditional hunting method and use a spear when you're hunting dugongs. So I think it's really interesting that people, although they're still doing these huntings, they are actually using environmentally conservative methods to do it and making sure that dugongs exist for generations to come.
Nice segue into our next environmental question. Why are ghost nets an environmental problem? That one's from Diane.
Yeah, so basically ghost nets, they're a big problem in the environment. They're made for catching fish. And so once they fall off a boat or once they're discarded off a major fishing boat, they continue to catch fish. It's not great for the environment in the sense that a lot of animals get caught up in these nets and they wipe out a lot of marine life in the oceans. They also wash up on the beaches and they cause a lot of environmental litter and things like that.
And how does the making of the ghost net sculptures reduce the environmental impact of the ghost nets?
Yeah, on a couple of different levels. On a really practical level, they're just removing nets from the environment, which is great in itself. Making these beautiful pieces of art, though, also helps to raise the profile and tell people about the environmental problem that is ghost nets. Making something so beautiful and so attractive makes people want to look at it and then gives people and the artists an opportunity to actually tell that underlying story. And we've actually got some ghost net sculptures here. So these ones were made by Arab artists up in the TSI, and I don't know how much sort of definition you guys can all see at home, but they're actually made out of woven nets that have been pulled apart into different pieces. And the nets aren't coloured at all. Fishing nets come in all kinds of colours, and they just use the different ones that they find on the beaches to make these beautiful objects. And you can see that they overlay net and they use stitching and they put everything together, and I think they're just so attractive and such really tactile pieces of art that are really wonderful to have in our collection.
Yeah. They're the sort of thing you really want to pick up and handle, but don't do that with museum pieces. Louise would like to know, what is the coming of the light and why does it matter?
Well, yeah, so in the video we talked about the sculpture by Nancy Kiewat, and it's commemorating this coming of the light. So the Coming of the Light Festival happens on the 1st of July every year, and it's actually celebrating the arrival of Christianity in the Torres Strait. So Christianity is a really important part of life up there, and in 1871, basically a missionary named Reverend Samuel McFarlane, he arrived in the islands and was welcomed by an elder from a warrior clan on Arab, and his name was Dabad. And Christianity arriving sort of had a few really big impacts on the Torres Strait. Some of the different clans that lived on the different islands were actually sort of not at war but had disagreements, and so Christianity brought all of those people together and actually brought peace to the islands. It also meant that there was some sort of representation for people, I guess is the right way to put it, where being Christian and having access to these missionaries meant that people were able to have someone represent them in sort of this changing life, especially in the marine industry, where people from the Torres Strait weren't often treated very well. And now they had somebody to talk on their behalf and work with these European industries that were coming into the Torres Strait.
Not always the story that we hear about Christianity coming to First Nations cultures. Mm-hmm. That's a tongue twister. Try saying that 10 times really fast at home. Grace has asked about the making of sculptures and helping with the problem of ghost nets. We preempted you a little bit, Grace. Sorry about that. I hope that you got enough of an answer.
There are some incredible pieces. Sorry to interrupt, Penny, but there are some
ahead.
incredible pieces. While you're at home, take some time to go to the Arab Arts website and have a look there. They've got some amazing videos about the works that they've created and sort of the environmental message. They even took some of these pieces to London, and the installation that they put in there is incredible. So take some time to have a look there.
Nicholas would like to know, do they speak a different language in the Torres Strait?
They do. They speak English, of course, but there are also 2 different language groups in the Torres Strait. We've got Meriam Mer and Kalalaga Yo. I probably butchered that, I'm sorry. But there are many dialects underneath these 2 language groups, but those are the 2 main ones that are spoken in the Torres Strait today.
Martha has a question for us. Where do ghost net sculpture weaving techniques come from, and what materials were used for weaving in the past?
Yeah, I think you could see when we were in the video and we were looking at the canoe, you could see that the sails were actually made out of woven palm leaves. So things like vines and leaves and that sort of thing, they were actually used to create baskets and skirts and headdresses and all kinds of things before any of these kind of more modern materials got to the Torres Strait. So I think that those kinds of techniques were really adapted to this new sort of medium and using the nets. But there's been a lot of development in that, and these basic weaving techniques have been built on, and people have been learning more and more. And I think you could see in the sculpture that Nancy Kiewat did, how she'd also used netting as stuffing, and she'd used it to stitch in details. So it's kind of an evolving art form, and I'm sure it will keep evolving in that people will keep coming up with new and interesting ways to use the ghost nets.
Madeleine would like to know, Madeleine? Oh, I think so, yeah. What's an element of the TSI culture that isn't represented in the museum that you personally would like to see added to the stories that you share?
Oh, that's a really good one. We have some incredible pieces that aren't on display at the moment. One of them is a really huge dance headdress. They're incredibly intricate. It's you can look them up on our Collection Explorer. It's a really good way to see some of our pieces that we can't show you today. This one has sharks on it, and it's actually used as part of cultural performance. And it would be really great to find space to be able to put some of those really big objects out on display. Unfortunately, our walls are only one size, and we can't move them out to make more gallery space. But those kind of really large-scale objects are some of the ones that I would love to see on display.
Are they the Dari headdresses? Is that?
Yeah, these ones aren't specifically Dari. The Dari as I was talking about in the video, the dari are actually mostly feathers, and they're sort of a white U shape of feathers that are worn on the head. And they're mostly used while dancing and as part of ceremony, and they're really an iconic feature of the Torres Strait. These masks are huge. They're probably 3 or 4 times the size of a dari, and I can imagine they're actually very difficult to wear and dance in, but they're sort of the next step up from a dari, I guess you could say.
Alana would like to know what kinds of things were made out of pearl shell.
Oh gosh, all different kinds of things. So people used pearl shell before plastic was invented. So the main thing that they sort of made out of pearl shell was buttons on all different kinds of clothing, and buttons from the Torres Strait were actually sent right across the globe, and people used them all over the world. But they also made things like the handles on cutlery, handles on brushes, and the backs of mirrors. They put together some really beautiful decorative pieces of furniture where they inlaid the mother of pearl into the wood. So really, like anything that you can think of would have been made out of pearl shell before plastics were invented. So it's a really interesting piece of history.
Yeah, I think I've got a pearl shell powder compact that I inherited from my grandmother. It's got a lyrebird carved in the top of it. Yeah. From the studio, why was pearling such a big industry in the Torres Strait Islands?
Well, the islands are pretty perfectly set up for natural pearls, really. There's a whole chain of them. There's a lot of quite shallow water, and it's like a really nice tropical environment. So there was a lot of natural pearl that existed there. And it sort of was this perfect situation where economically pearl was worth a lot, and there weren't huge resources of it, and so the pearling industry kind of took off in the Torres Strait because it was this perfect environment for there to be natural pearl available.
Well, thank you very much for joining us here at your museum from home, Michaela. I think that's all we've got time for this afternoon, unfortunately. Thank you to everybody who tuned in at home. It was really lovely to have you here, and you had some really fantastic questions. We look forward to seeing you again next week for our live stream on the paddle steamer Enterprise, on the topic of the paddle steamer, possibly not on the actual paddle steamer, but you never know what might happen. And we look forward to hosting you here at the museum once again on our beautiful Acton site when we can. Thank you very much.